We're live with the Faustiest Witch of them all, Chris. I'm going to call you that every episode. Yeah, I know, it's a little bit strange, isn't it? But there we go. I just, not used to the graphics. Oh, what happened there? I don't know what's going on. Right, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Carry on.
Brilliant. Okay, so
it's good.
Today's episode / topic / what we're chatting about is cunning folk for the second time today.
Yeah, technically for the second time today. Because
we did a podcast all about traditional witchcraft earlier today. It's not going to be released yet, so don't worry. You are the first to know about all of this. Well, you're not really the first to know because, well, people have known about this for several hundred years at this point. But, you know, the first to know on the Paranormal Keep on Chatting Network thing. So, archetypal cunning folk. If someone rocked up to you, Chris, and assuming you had a little conversation, they didn't just come up to you and say this, but imagine you had a conversation and they come up to you and you say, oh, what do you do? And they say, I'm a cunning man, professional cunning man. What would you think? What would you attribute to that? What would go through your head?
Well, I suppose in first instance, it would be kind of thinking, okay, is he a time traveller?
There are modern cunning folk. People call us cunning folk.
I suppose, but we don't fully fulfill all the criteria, do we? I can't remember last time I delivered a baby.
We charge money for magic.
Yeah,
what more do you want? What more do you want?
Well, I don't deliver babies.
No, but you abort them magically. And you sterilize people magically, so I don't know. There's some baby-related magics in there.
I do some of the gynecologicals, I guess. But yeah, I suppose the gynecologicals. But I suppose because I think of it as an archetype, I suppose I don't connect with it day to day as I kind of probably should. So I still prefer the term we use, professional witch, makes far more sense to me in the modern day than it does cunning folk. Although you're slightly different to me, though.
Am I?
Well, you have the stories of the cunning folk.
I have the story.
Understanding of the lineage.
I'm more of an archetypal cunning man than you, I think.
Yeah.
Because I got more of a reputation for being able to be bought.
Yeah.
Than you do, I suppose. So if this person, some dude rocks up to you and says, yo, I is a cunning man, after you say what you do for a living, what would you think? What would go through your connotation?
Well, my first response would probably be, I ain't heard of you.
Ah, I see.
Would be my first thought.
Very good.
I'm not sure I've heard of you. What makes you a cunning man? And then obviously they'd probably have a bag and open and show me their wares.
Lucky.
That's what I think of. That's what I think of when I think of cunning man. Oh. I think of one of those door-to-door salesmen that sell vacuum cleaners and demo it in your home.
Okay, right.
Is that bad?
Well, I thought I'd start with these questions to see from a professional witch's perspective what you as a professional witch think of when you think of cunning folk. But now we should probably actually explain what cunning folk are, because there's a big history of it, and there's many books written about them. So, Chris, technically, what is a cunning person?
So it would be, I suppose, a traditional witch or walk cunner, I guess. So a person that knows herbal magic, is capable of understanding healing, that would offer enough services for the everyday muggle, or mundane as we would call them.
Okay, So someone in the magical community that the local community, people in the local community could approach for magical work, but also maybe, their knowledge essentially, isn't it? It's their kind of
Yeah,
knowledge from times gone by when people didn't have the resources and services that are available now and the technology or really the know-how. There was no YouTube. There wasn't even no books because a lot of people couldn't
no,
read. No literacy,
no.
no schools, all that sort of thing. So, cunning folk, then, what we're talking about is we're talking about magical practitioners that are known by their local community, sometimes a bit further afield, um, and people would approach them for services. So it's kind of what nowadays we kind of call service magicians or professional witches.
Yeah, professional witches.
So professional witches from back in the day. Now, why would they have been referred to normally as cunning folk or similar things? Why not witch? Why wouldn't they call them a witch? Or would they?
Well, one which isn't so much a word that was used back then. That's a fairly modern term. Whether or not you would agree with that.
It's a word that's been used for what, about several hundred years, maybe up to 1,000 years or so, but it's not necessarily been a nice word. So you wouldn't
No.
necessarily want to be called one. Not necessarily an insult, although some people call it an insult. Oh, that horrible little witch cut me up the other day on the motorway. It is one of those things that, this has got a lot of connotations, and a lot of the connotations still today are negative, but they would have often been even more negative back in the day. So people tried to distance themselves as magical practitioners from the word witch by calling themselves other things, because it's not necessarily always good for business, although sometimes it can be good for business. So,
But my question is, because I don't actually know the answer, believe it or not, is why cunning? Because to me, cunning, I think of Wily Fox, wise but in a trickster kind of way. So why cunning?
well, generally because of the kind of segregation of different parts of the country. Like nowadays, we think we can just hop on in a car or on the train or even on a long distance coach and go from Bristol to where you live up in the Midlands.
Yeah.
And it'll only take a couple of hours, if that. Back in the day, you're talking about, you probably wouldn't, if you're an everyday person, you probably wouldn't be moving outside of your local community. If you lived in a city, you wouldn't really be traveling outside of that. If you lived in a village, very often you wouldn't necessarily be traveling outside of that. So all of these villages and that would have different slang words, because we still have that nowadays in the UK. You say words up where you are, and we say words down here where I am. And I don't understand what Chris is talking about sometimes when he mentions like yam yams and that. Is it yam yams?
Yam yams from the
Yam
back country.
yams. Yeah. So, but each community would probably have a name that they would give to the local magical practitioner. They'd call them something. Old Mother Red Cap, if there's an old woman, old wise woman. There's traditions of being called names. Pellers, cunning folk is one of those terms. It's just one of the terms that is quite a popular one still today, and that a lot of authors, when they research cunning folk and cunning folk practices, they call them cunning folk because that was one of the more widely used words. So authors kind of, when they write about them today, and researchers tend to pick up on that. There are a couple of kind of differences like pellers and such. Often you'd probably think of them as not necessarily being a jack of all trades, being able to do a little bit of everything like most modern day witches. They might only be able to do one or two different types of charms or spells. But a lot of the more famous cunning folk, you're talking about famous magical practitioners that would service the everyday community. So we're not talking about the kind of John Dee's ceremonial magicians of the court.
Performing magic tricks.
Yeah, we're talking about the everyday person that lives on the edge of the village, that if you've hurt yourself, old Fanny Crannock, she knows how to mix a potion together, make a salve, whatever it is, a little bit of herbal magic and a little charm and spell to say over that wound to fix it. So the real difference, I think, nowadays is that back then we'd think about cunning folk practices as very much survivalist magic, survivalist witchcraft, whereas today it's less so. Today it's more about witchcraft being a hobby or a vehicle for discovery, for exploration of the magical world, the supernatural world, whatever you want to call it. Back then, not so much. Back then, people didn't have the time to go investigating. They cared about whether the crops were going to grow. They cared about whether they could put food on the table. They cared about very mundane things, and they wanted magic for helping them in those mundane things. So we've got a question. If I could load it up. Is being a cunning man or woman a viable profession nowadays, really? Yes, it is. So technically, I get lumbered into the cunning man category. Now, we normally would refer to ourselves as professional witches, partly because people have more of an idea of what witches are. But I still have people in the local area that I'm from the southwest of the UK, from the West Country, that don't call me a witch. They call me a cunning man. So cunning man, wise woman, all of these words for professional witches, it could be very dangerous, but also very profitable. Because if you think about it, you're being paid for your knowledge and abilities and skills. So the local butcher, baker, or candlestick maker, they do those things. You, on the other hand, would be able to do a lot of different things. And a lot of the time it will be emergency kind of things. So if old Farmer John gets his sheep stolen, they would call upon you to find out who stole the sheep. Where's the sheep? You know, what's going on with the sheep? Why aren't they buying? You know, so it would be kind of like multi-skilled. It might be a vet slash midwife slash doctor, because we didn't have access to those things back in the day. So these were quite sought after skills. And magic and science weren't really divorced like they are now. So if you wanted to do a healing for someone, there wasn't a village doctor. They didn't have doctors back then. You'd go to the local wise person. Maybe if there was kind of like later on, you know, medieval times and such, you might have a local monastery or something where you might have a monastery with monks that grew healing herbs and stuff like that, were able to do a bit of herbal medicine. But the majority of people in a rural location would be quite reliant on local practitioners, which could sometimes get them into trouble. Nowadays, it is the work changes. So although
that's the difference, isn't it? It's the fact that actually, you know, I'm not going to have to go and perform a C-section or deliver a baby, because we have midwives for that. I'm not likely to go catch the guy who stole your sheep because we have police for that. You know,
but
I'm not going
the
to have to.
When the police fails or when the doctors fail, where do they come a running? They might not become running. Where might they be wielding their wheelchairs till? They'd be coming to us, because they'll be, I've got this thing the doctor can't fix. Can you use magic to do something about that? Very often the cunning folk would be the first port of call because they were the only port of call. Nowadays, they tend to be more the second port of call. So yes,
which means we have to be more specialist than we probably were in times of gone.
Yeah. But yeah, it is literally a case of, if you think of it as a business, so that's what you're talking about, the business of magical arts, but not servicing extremely affluent people like kings and queens and that, because the difference is normally a king or queen, they would house and keep a magical practitioner, John Dee, whoever it is, the court magician. They'd very often have people that you are the court magician. You work exclusively for said family, rich family. king, queen, whatever. Whereas cunning folk is very much a case of you're the person in the village that knows this work, knows this stuff.
Mm.
So yeah, it can be incredibly, can make a lot of money, but at the same time, it's a business. So it depends on how much you charge and what you exchange. Nowadays, much like back then, not only would we exchange money, but we might also exchange other things. I've done work for people in exchange for meals. People have cooked me meals and they've said, come over, I'll cook you a meal. Can you fix this problem? There's something going on in my house. I want you to get rid of it. Yeah, that's fine. But there's normally always, with cunning folk, there's always a kind of bartering. There's always a price to pay, which some people like, some people don't like. The one thing I always try to explain to clients, and also modern practitioners, is that when there is a price to be paid for a service, that constitutes a magical contract. There is a beginning and an end to the deal. If you owe someone a favor, what then happens should they choose to collect on said favor? It can get very murky. Whereas, give me £100 to bottle up that ghost and get rid of it for you, and that's it. They either pay the money or they don't. Well, if they pay the money, if you don't perform the service and it doesn't work, then, much like back in the day, we often think of cunning folk and that as being persecuted. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it didn't happen. There are many instances where cunning folk have been taken to court and tried to be prosecuted for witchcraft, and the judges turned around and said, no, that's a load of crock of crap. There are instances where cunning folk have been used as expert witnesses to say, that person over there is a witch. I know that because I'm a good magical practitioner, and I'm saying because I'm an expert in magic, that person is a witch. Burn the witch, or hang the witch, or drown the witch, or do whatever it is to the witch that's nasty, stick all poke her up her ass. I don't know. Oh, here we go. We got another one. The cunning folk, knowledge passed down in families before the days of doctors on every street comes. They knew about plants, healing illnesses. There was no such thing as a witch back then. There were healers, but if you upset them, they could take offense. No, so that's not strictly true. So in terms of witch, saying that there's no witches back then, what there were, of course, witches, because there was always someone trying to blame things on the witches. Yeah. So the word witch, when you look at the origins of the word, or when it was used, when it first kind of originally started popping up. So if you look around the medieval period, witch meant magical practitioner of maleficent, baneful, evil magic. So you're talking about the sort of person that goes and hexes and curses people. That sort of magic would be classed as witchcraft. And there were laws against it. Like with anything, you can go back to Egyptian pharaohs, you can look into Greeks. There's always laws against using magic against the king or the queen. So there's always laws that govern magic. Harry Potter has the Ministry of Magic, of course. In the real world, it would be the king or queen or whatever it is. There would be laws that would govern the misuse of magic. Very often in the UK, Britain, Europe, what we'd refer to as those that misuse magic, or those that use forms of magic that aren't deemed acceptable, we class them as witches. The problem is because the word witch was associated with the law, if you were guilty of maleficent magic, you were guilty of practicing witchcraft. So people misused the law. So they might say, that person over there I don't like, yeah, she's a witch, get rid of her. And they might get rid of her. They might prosecute her for that. At the same time, you might have a folk healer that they might say, I don't like that folk healer. Us in our monastery, we're the only ones that are supposed to be doing healing magic and that. We don't call it magic. We call it Jesus' miracles. But we should be the ones doing that. That person over there shouldn't be doing it. I know what we'll do. We'll call her a witch and we'll get her. So, what happened would you start using the word witch and labeling people of witches, and then the meaning of words changes, because then it's like, well, that old lady was a healing people. Is she a witch? Well, if witchcraft is more than just doing that, then surely there are good witches and bad witches. And then you can kind of see in the 17th and 18th century that the word witch, and you start hearing about people referring to themselves or referring to other people as white witches or black witches. Are you the good sort or are you the bad sort? And people would make cunning folk would adopt this, because remember, you're running a business. So you will find certain people that would refer to themselves as witches. They would say,
because it's good for business.
Because it's good for business. And to a certain extent, both. So there will be people that say, or used to say, I am a white witch, meaning, don't worry, I've got your back. Come to me, I'll tell your fortune. I'll do a little tea leaf reading or something like that. Don't worry, I'm a goodie. You can trust me, is what was good for business. But at the same time, if you look at other people, when required, you could think of certain people. George Beecham would have been an example. 18th century, Somerset. He was referred to as a black witch. So were they referred to as a black witch because they wanted people to leave them alone, or wanted to scare people? It is kind of difficult. So nowadays we're perfectly happy to adopt the word witch. Back then, when the word witch was seen as just a negative thing, or a predominantly negative thing, people wouldn't really do it. But the word does come from somewhere, and it comes from the...
But witch now as a word is more, it's one of these reclaimings, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not, it doesn't actually really have, other than kind of Disney or horror movies and stories, it doesn't, that's its modern context. So, you know, it's an attempt to reclaim a word, you know, like we struggle with the word queer. Like it's one of those words that, you know, has bad or you know, questionable origins, that is trying to be reclaimed with certain communities. And that's the thing. I think part of the problem now with the use of the word is the fact that it's a label exercise, isn't it? It's I want to be this kind of witch or that kind of witch, a green witch, a kitchen witch, what's that one everyone uses nowadays? Eclectic.
Hedge witch.
Hedge witch again, but that again is another claiming of a particular title. Like you say, they're archetypes that we focus on for particular understanding. Like I said, we tend to use the word professional witch. You get called cunning man. It's not a word I would ever be called. More likely to call me a word that rhymes with witch than they are to call me a cunning man. But but yeah, it's more of a reclaiming of a title. I quite like the white versus a black, left and right, and good and bad, as a marketing exercise.
Yeah, that's essentially where a lot of it comes from. Yeah,
that just fascinates me that, you know, you would want to be called either. Obviously, because of the current context you've got for now, as it being a kind of new age revivalist kind of title that's used. I wouldn't dream being called either. I think I'd take offense at either one of those, to be honest. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
So I don't know what you want to go on to next, but I think we've got another question. It was always for payment for what they needed, food or money, but it wasn't known as witchcraft then. So yeah, I mean, you don't need to look too far to really see, because nowadays I can talk to many different clients, and different clients are comfortable with calling me different things. There are magical practitioners in the local community that call me a cunning man, that say I have a cunning man's business, because they're from quite educated people. They know a lot about the history of magic. They know that I can kind of fit that archetype. At the same time, the everyday person, they think, oh, someone that practices magic, they must be a witch. That's the only word that I know, so that's what I'm going to call them. And then you'll get other people that may not like me necessarily, that may say, oh, well, he messes a lot with all of that magic and all that stuff, saying it comes from the devil. He's a witch, you know? Yeah. So it's words at the end of the day. And remember, cunning folk, professionals, therefore they are going to use whatever word suits their marketing strategy. and today is the same.
I think that's the bit I like about it most, is it's, you know, which we joked at the beginning, which is it is a professional standing. It is a case of somebody who has a reputation for being it.
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't necessarily call yourself a cunning man, but you'd encourage others to call you it because it's good for business.
Yeah.
So, you know, you wouldn't have gone from town to town claiming you were a cunning man, but you'd make sure somebody called you it.
Some of course would, but what you tend to find is that different to today, it's very different to today, 20th century magic backwards. So 20th century professional magic after the 20th century is a lot different to before, because after the 20th century, what you have is you will have a lot of famous buzzwords: Alexandrian witchcraft, Wicca, this and that, religions, various other things that are associated with it. People think of what form of practice you have now. They don't think about you as a practitioner. Back then, no one in the village had a clue what sort of magic you performed. They wouldn't label it. It was just magic. What they did know is they knew your name and reputation. So nowadays we think of categorizing different witches and that. They say, well, that person over there, they are a Wiccan. They do Wiccan-y stuff. They do god and goddess worship. They do this, they do that. People think more nowadays about the magical practice of what the person's probably doing, partly because they've got more information, but partly because a lot of that is pushed out there as a marketing technique.
Yeah, and obviously people go for that specific system, don't they, that they like the sound of, or that the buzzword they've heard of, you know, like Reiki or psychic or medium. They're all words that people associate with certain structures.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you wouldn't catch many people calling themselves a spiritualist, but then during Victorian England, that would be a good buzzword to use. Like the buzzwords change, don't they, as time goes on.
Yeah, and a lot of it will stem for, if you're talking about cunning folk practices, you're talking about not particularly well-educated people a lot of the time. You're talking about survivalist witchcraft, survivalist magic, survivalist techniques that are passed along. Now, were they passed along through families? Sometimes not necessarily. Sometimes, a lot of the time, even they weren't passed along at all. So they just died out. No. And there's a mix between, because the education is the real problem with that. If you grew up with an innate magical ability and you start to become famous for that, say you're a psychic and you start to do a lot of psychic work and stuff and see the future really easily, then you're probably going to be getting a reputation. Eventually you might set up shop or do for extra money, do readings and stuff like that. You might be started to be put into the cunning folk category, but there's a big difference between, is really the professionalism a lot of the time. A lot of the time you're talking about the pillar cornerstone of the community, the person that everyone goes to because they know a bit about healing, they know a bit about this, they know a bit about that. They can do a little bit of everything. Nowadays, when we look at witches, we often think the same thing. It's why we see things. You would expect a witch to be able to talk with spirits and stuff. You'd expect a witch to be able to, cast spells. You'd expect a witch to be able to diagnose things. Expect a witch to do pretty much a little bit of everything magical. They're like the GPs of the magical world, is what you'd expect them to be. Back then, there weren't a huge amount of resources. The cunning man, wise woman, whatever, the local practitioner was the best you really had. Even going up to Victorian periods, there were doctors and stuff, but they were expensive. There was no NHS. You wouldn't be going and affording a doctor. You'd still be reliant on the local cunning man. I've worked, because I used to work in construction, I've worked in places where they still rely on local cunning folk practices and people to do things. I've worked on large estates where they're trying to find where pipes are buried for swimming pool filtration systems or cabling and stuff, and they get the local man that has divining rods that goes out and finds and says, where's the cable? I'll get old John down the road. He's great with his rods. he'll find it, and they call him up. Some of these practices still kind of exist and carry on today.
Yeah, well,
But
dowsing's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
It actually still has a professional
Yeah.
A professional requirement.
But normally it's the practitioners that will change. So people are less reliant on a magical practitioner to fix all of their problems, because you can go to the doctors. We've got the NHS in this country. If you go to other places in the world, your local witch doctor is the equivalent of what our cunning folk used to be. So it is still there. And it's just that our kind of the words that we use and that does change. Our practices change slightly, and we evolve now. We didn't necessarily, cunning folk didn't always necessarily evolve as quickly. Nowadays, if you've got a magical practitioner and they apply themselves, there's a huge amount of resources. You've got the internet, you've got other practitioners that you can talk to, the moot system, we could talk about magical moots, all that sort of thing. It's one of those things. Speaking of the devil, was he actually part of historic cunning practices, or is this a more modern thing? Interesting question, actually. So when you're talking about cunning folk practices in the word use, you're normally talking medieval period to 20th century. So those sorts of magical practitioners. You're talking normally Europe or Britain, more specifically, we're talking about today.
Heavily Christian.
Most people are Christian. If they're not Christian, there's some form of Christian that is hiding in Christianity. So yes, most people were Christian. Therefore, there was probably a belief in the devil. Now, a lot of the stories that you get of witches and witch trials, you tend to hear about confessions and stuff like that. That's a difficult one, because yes, there are a lot of people that confessed to working with the devil and stuff, but they were being tortured at the time. So
in order to do that, so
how tight do those thumb screws need to be before you tell them what they want to hear, sort of thing. There is such a tradition within modern forms of magic. Some traditions, such as Cochranite traditions and stuff, traditional witchcraft in modern times, they have this idea of the folk devil, the man in black, the person at the crossroads, Papa Legba, that sort of an archetype of Hermes, Mercury. So there are people nowadays, witches, that claim to work with some sort of what they'd call a folk devil. There are also people back then which would have been distraught, and if you were a Christian and you believed in Christianity and you figured that you're having a crappy life and that Jesus or God hates you, they might go a running to the devil. So if they believed in a God and Jesus and the devil, they would probably think, well, I've tried it with him, I'm going to go over to him now. So there was probably people that would have, but
when you're referring to the word folk devil, you're not actually referring to
the Christian devil,
Christian devil, which would be Satan, Lucifer, etc., etc. You're talking about an entity where the word devil means something different, meaning deceiver or great, great trickster, or all of those words, traitor, all of those words, and you're not actually talking about devil as what we think of, a Judeo-Christian kind of concept.
Again, it's a word with different connotations, because again, you wouldn't be thinking normally devil, you would be thinking devils as in a type of spirit as well, the devils. So it's a difficult thing. I think in a lot of cunning folk practices that come later, and certainly a lot of 21st century magic and 20th century traditional witchcraft, you get the idea of the folk devil as what is referred to as the man in black, the spirit of the crossroads that can be worked with. I don't really refer to it as a folk devil, but then I normally refer to a specific spirit that has a specific name. So most of the time I wouldn't use words that describe almost like a race of types of spirit. So when you're talking about devils, often you're talking about people thinking that they are a race of a specific type of spirit. What sort of spirit is that? That's a jinn, that's a fae, that's the devil. So it's kind of a little bit difficult. In
It's
terms of
interchangeable with the word demon or daemon, depending on where in the world you are.
So yes, I'm sure there were people that tried to work with the Christian devil. I'm sure there are other people that tried to work with other things that would have been labeled or mislabeled as the devil. There are people today that try and work with the devil. In terms of cunning folk practices, the real problem with cunning folk practices is that their practices were very much kept secret or passed on specifically orally or in the form of an apprenticeship, sometimes specifically to people, not really written down. What we know
And
of
those
a
that
lot of
is probably from lawsuits and things like that, I guess.
Yeah. And a lot of things
court
that
records
you would get in books or when you do research, such as this Cunning Man's Handbook, would be second-hand accounts. So I was the client of a cunning man. What did that cunning man do? Well, he got this, and then he got this, and then he mixed these two things together, and then he gave me this, and then he told me to go and bury it at the crossroads at midnight, sort of thing. So they're not getting all of it. They're not necessarily getting all of the practices. So a lot of the practices are hidden. I'm actually starting a spell casting course, which is free on YouTube. The first video goes on tonight, which actually not only teaches the spells, is really teaching you about the mechanisms behind the spells. Because what you'll get is you'll get lots of people which buy books and that look at YouTube videos, and they get things like this that will show you a spell, and they do the thing on the spell and nothing happens because you're only seeing the physical part. A lot of the documentation on cunning folk is, well, I asked a cunning man or wise woman to do this, and they gave me this little bag and it had this herb in it. Well, they're only seeing the physical part. They don't know the other energetic parts and stuff.
It's the recipe book thing again, isn't it? It's a case of you can buy a recipe book, but unless you've actually had some practice at cooking and baking, etc., that book is only going to do so much for you. You follow it to the letter, but if you don't understand how the ingredients interact, you're probably going to end up with a crap cake or bread that doesn't rise, and you just kind of, well, I did exactly what the book said. But obviously, you know, when we write down things, we write things down in shorthand. You don't include your knowledge when you're writing it. You're giving instruction, and that's often the problem.
What else? What's the next topic of conversation then? If you've got any specific questions, then obviously by all means write them in the comments and let us know.
I think a good example of a common charm would be good.
Okay, so the one that I used today is to get rid of warts. So there was one that I used to get rid of warts, which uses a bean shell, so a little bit of sympathetic magic. So normally when you open books and things like that, you'll get cunning folk using charms. The cunning folk themselves should understand how to empower that charm, how to use that spell, the magical technology behind that, how it works. They don't pass that on. What they'll do is they'll do the charm normally. They're not paid to teach. We obviously nowadays, we tend to set up more as trying to teach people more than actually service magicians, because we prefer teaching to just taking people's money and doing a charm. It gets boring after a while. I mean, I can only hex so many people's ex-husbands in one day before I get bored, you know, whereas teaching different people in different ways is a lot more fun, keeps things more interesting. But think of something like this. If you've got an old cunning man or wise woman and you've got a little problem with some spirits or some negative energy, and they give you a horseshoe to put above your door, they may have done something to that horseshoe. They may have imbued it with some sort of power. They've then given it to you. What the client just sees is, well, they gave me a horseshoe. They gave me a horseshoe. Oh, well, old Fanny Crannock, I tell you, I had this problem with some pesky stuff. They kept walking through the door at night and rattling the door and stuff. She gave me this horseshoe. I put it above the door and it's all gone now. You should go and do that. Or I might go and do that. And then it becomes a thing. So that's when magical spells and stuff start turning into superstition, because superstition essentially is magical practices very often where people have forgotten how they work. It's kind of like if you have a computer and then you take all the microchips out. You're left with the shell. The magical spells very often that you see a lot of people try to copy, you're just copying the shell. You're just doing the physical things.
Yeah.
Well, I got this candle, and then I got this herb that it told me to do, and then I put that down and I burnt the candle. Well, you're just doing the physical aspects. There are obviously energetic aspects to that, and that gets missed. So old things like how to utilize magic squares, magical timings, pulling in the energies at specific times. All of these sorts of things don't necessarily get passed on. And when they do get passed on, they're often confused. So like Chris, we were talking at one point about, oh, okay, I've got an element. You've got an element. The witch makes a little potion and she says, you need to be taking this potion until the moon is full. Well, someone might think of that as, oh, the moon magic. Yeah, that's right. So the moon is full. So the moon's magical. It's gotten involved in that. When actually it's a case of there aren't any clocks.
Don't have a clock.
There aren't any clocks. We don't have phones. We don't have, anything like that.
Yeah.
But what we can do is look out the window and see when the moon is full and know, oh, my course of treatment is a complete. I don't need to take the medicine anymore.
I don't need to take the medicine no more because
Because old Fanny Cranach knows, oh, the moon phases in this one is going to take X amount of time. If I go over that amount of time, then it's probably not such a good idea to be taking this powerful potion. Get rid of that, that sort of thing. One thing that we haven't talked about is con artists. And
of course.
Because remember,
Snake
this
oil
is a
salesman.
business. Yeah, this is a business. Cunning folk are... their art form is essentially business, the business of magic. So much like today, you have a lot of psychics that aren't really psychic. You have crap psychics, and then you have fake psychics. The fake psychics are essentially the con artists. So you've got cunning folk or people that don't really know much magic, but they know they can make, because there's a lot of money can be made out of it, they can get people and get money off of them. What you'll tend to find, though, is that said people tend to move around quite a lot. So a cunning man, wise woman often would establish themselves in an area in which they live in and become famous in that area because of the reputation they've got, you see. So everyone...
And people would start to travel for them.
Yeah, people will come from outside of town as they become more famous and come into town. Whereas what you do find with some stories of unscrupulous people is, well, they
move about
conned a bunch of people in that village, so they might move to another village, con them, and then move on, and then move on, and then move on. Now, of course, there are going to be con artists and such, and normally that's why it's so important to go by reputation, because it was all about reputation. Nowadays, if you've got a good plumber or a good electrician or a plasterer and that, you care more about their reputation from someone that you know than what a glossy advert says on Facebook or something like that. We care about
trade checker.
Trade checker. Yeah, checkertrade.com.
Yeah. Well, I've had some really bad ones from those recently, actually.
So, on the word energy, what would that have been called in the past? Like how Cornish Peller called it sprawl and such. Is there a more general, centralized, non-religion specific term? Well, that's a really interesting question. So again, it's down really to the language that people use. We use the term energy because we've all been, or for the most part, probably the majority of people who are listening to this, I've been through some sort of science lessons at school. So we understand the basic connotations of it. Yeah, post-electricity. We understand the word energy. It has connotations. In terms of communicating things, one thing to remember is that a lot of cunning folk, they wouldn't pass their information on to the clients, because if they tell the clients how the magics are done and can teach them the spells, why does the client need to go back to them? Don't need them anymore. So there is a big kind of thing about keeping your magical practices a secret. So you're not going to start explaining about things like that. In terms of specifically what was used, it's going to depend on the person and the paradigm in which they're in. You'll find in some modern practices such as hoodoo, if you ask a hoodoo practitioner how does the spell that you cast work? They'll say, I did a petition-based spell that relies on me asking this spirit, Jesus, or whatever, or the ancestors for this help. Okay, so the power behind what the spells is, that would not be explained to a customer because that's the secret sauce. The is it KFC that has the secret chicken sauce that everyone probably knows about? The secret sauce. This is why you don't see it in a lot of books, is because it's kept secret. You can by all means copy what herbs to use, what candle to use, because the cat's out of the bag. If you give someone a candle, they know the spell involves a candle. But if you do something magical to the candle and they can't sense or see that, all they see is the candle. So in terms of keeping things secret, in terms of the words that were used, is really quite difficult because, again, you've got regional dialects. You've also got the fact that they're probably going to be trying to keep you dumb. They're not really wanting to explain the mechanisms of it. So you could refer to something as the power of the Holy Spirit, which you would get as kind of some sort of modern jumpy up and down church might say, I'm using the power of the Holy Spirit, that sort of thing. Probably wouldn't do that back in the day. What you would often find is they would perhaps, whether they were a Christian or not a Christian, because again, predominant religion, Christianity, if they were using the Bible, like that big one behind me, I use sometimes. I'm not a Christian, but I'm perfectly happy to use that massive spell book behind me because it's been used. And there's a lot of power behind some of the words in there. What they could do is they could say to someone, well, and I'm not saying I have or haven't done this, and say, right, okay, we're going to cure this illness or treat this illness using magic, or we're going to use the magic of the Bible or something. So in that case, they're not really talking about energy. They're leaving it open for the person, the client, to say, so they're going to be tapping into some sort of thing. So the word magic is literally the perfect term. So it's not energy such, because we think of things scientifically as magic. And if you say, I'm using magic, instead of I'm using, raising energy and directing energy, it keeps everything mysterious. And magic still is, and always has been, mysterious. It's been mysterious because we want to keep it that way. Apart from the fair few that we mentor, but everyone else we want to keep it mysterious, I know. What's your opinion?
It's good for business.
It's good for business, yeah.
It's good for business. If there are lots of people out there that wouldn't like the fact that we talk quite too openly about slightly more advanced magics. And that's
I've been threatened. I've been told I've got to shut my mouth or the Illuminati is going to come and kill me. I thought, that's fun. Good luck with that.
Good luck with that. But it's that kind of, as a reputation builds, you expect those things to happen. But a large part of it is that this is very open. It's the reason we have a Patreon, for example, is because there is some content that even we aren't comfortable putting out there for just about anybody. And the only way we can really separate it is by putting something behind a payment barrier. Somebody really wants to know that information, then they're willing to pay through there. They'll get some of that information. And just because you've got the schematics of a nuclear bomb doesn't mean you know how to build one. It's one of those kind of situations where, like with the recipe book, just because you've got a recipe book in front of you that tells you how to make the perfect cake doesn't mean you're going to achieve a perfect cake. For me, we have those problems in craft all the time, and by that I mean textiles, is the fact that obviously we quite frequently have shorthand maps of how we made a certain pattern or whatever. Another craftsman could pick up that schematic and go, oh, okay, I know what you've done there, recreate it. Might not necessarily be perfect unless they've got a piece of that in order to kind of reverse engineer it with the plan, if that makes sense. And there's a certain extent, like for us, when we go back into when someone's done a particular spell working, you go in and have a look at the space and what they've done and what ingredients they've included, and you kind of go, oh, okay, well, that's what you've done. And which deities were you pulling in at what way, and how did you pay them? And you kind of like, oh, okay, well, this is what you've done wrong. Go and pay that one off. Now, don't use that one again, because really you've upset them and you probably shouldn't keep doing that.
They didn't like you anyway.
Didn't like you anyway. So, you probably should have got permission before you went ahead and did that. A big one for us, I guess, is payment. Someone is capable or willing to pay you for certain work. It's a particular reason why both of us rarely do work for other people these days. We might tell you how to do it and give you an idea of what to do. But yeah, I'm very rarely moved enough to actually step in and do it myself for somebody, which would have been very different. Like, the whole point for the cunning man is that, all that process is secret, so that you keep coming back and you keep paying me for it. Whereas, yeah, I don't know if I could have hacked it, hence why I'm probably not called a cunning man by anybody. It's because, yeah, I wouldn't have hacked that. It would be a case of, no.
Yeah,
I've already seen 6 UTIs today. I don't need to see another one.
It's service industry at the end of the day. I mean, we predominantly teach, so we have the Fausty Witchcraft Patreon. We do a lot of training of cunning folk. We train cunning folk, we train witches, we train seers, we train psychics. We do training because that's what we enjoy. Now, I started my cunning folk business and started doing that more of a role because I was dragged into it. As soon as people think that you know a little bit about magic, the phone starts phoning, it starts ringing, and then you've not only just got a bunch of random people that are saying, oh, can you help me come over and move some furniture? You've got someone saying, help, my house is haunted, or, oh, I've got this weird disease thing and it won't go. Oh, I'm waking up in the middle of the night and something terrible is happening. Oh, I want to go and screw someone over. Can you help me do that? I've heard you're really good at that. Eventually, the phone don't stop ringing. There's more and more and more people. And you can either decide to embrace it, like I used to embrace it. I'd say, fine, I'll do that. I'm going to do that if you give me this, or if you do this for me. Cunning folk, that's how it would have been operated. Or you can push away and say, oh, I just can't be bothered with this. You know what? I don't want to do it. Just leave me alone, please. And you can retreat and go more into the shadows. If you embrace it, you're going to build a reputation, like the cunning folk did. If you push away from it, then you're going to be the weirdo that gets labeled the witch that no one really understands. But at the same time, what are they doing? You don't really know.
See, I got more of that. I was the weirdo witch. You had to be really brave to come and talk to me about it. And I liked that setting.
Yeah.
I've got no problem with that.
Okay, right. So last couple of questions, if anyone wants to ask the last couple of questions. What else? I don't know if we've covered everything. We've covered a little bit about what they actually are. We've talked about modern cunning folk practices. It isn't a word that gets used all that much. You'll find that this word is coming back a little bit. That's just due to a lot of actually it's witchcraft degrees. So within universities now, Bristol University
from
is
a historical point of view.
There are a lot of history degrees that you can do when you study history at a higher level, that people will start to specialize in things such as paganism, or they'll start to specialize in traditional British folk practices and stuff like that. So you find first it's the folkloric kind of degrees, then all of a sudden they specialize in the magic, and then this and then that. And then obviously, in order to actually advance your career through that, you need to pick a subject that hasn't really been picked. And over the past, I'd say 20 years-ish, certainly in the past 10 years, but in the past 20-ish years, you've got people that are going and doing that. They're writing papers on and more archaeological, I shouldn't really say, well, yeah, archaeological evidence, but also
No, I think that's safe.
documentation as well. People going through the archives of things, they're finding all of these different trial records and practices, and there's more about it. One guy who I met, Dr. Will Pooley, is probably going to be one of the world's foremost experts on kind of cunning folk in France, because it's not been researched. No one's really
But a
bothered
large part
to
of that is
research it.
digitization.
Yeah.
So there's a massive push at the minute for digitizing these archives.
Mm.
And therefore, you know, you've got access to information we didn't have before.
Okay, so how do you go about actually gaining a reputation? I take it it's based on a spell success. Are there any traditional ways of increasing your success rate? Yes. So
word of mouth would be my obvious one.
Word of mouth, generally, that's what you're talking about. So what you would be saying, let's take a different example, right? If you're a plumber, how do you gain a reputation? You gain a reputation from doing a good job. You'd gain a reputation from being cheap, being reliable, all those sorts of things. How you gain a reputation from business is other people talking about you. Okay, it's all about people talking about you. They'll talk about your success. They'll talk about how you helped them. They'll talk about all of these things. So it's pretty much all word of mouth. Now, when it comes to certain unscrupulous cunning folk, in terms of the traditional ways of increasing your success rate of what? Success rate of spells. How do you make your spells more effective? Well, you really need to delve into the art of spellcasting and learn about more and more of it, learn more about magic. But your success rate of acquiring new clients, well, is your reputation at the end of the day. If you've done 10 jobs and all of those jobs were successful and there's people are talking about it, what do you do then? Can you perhaps cause some trouble? Which goes into the con artistry of there'll be some people which go and steal old Farmer John's sheep only so that they can then tell him where they are and say, I used the power of magic to do that. So it really depends. More specifically, reputation is based on a spell success. Are there any traditional ways to increase your success rate? So yeah, in terms of success rate, we've literally got like 3 minutes left. So in terms of the art of spellcasting, our first Fausty Witches, we talked about spellcasting, kind of how it works to a certain extent. On the Thoth TV YouTube channel, we've got a spellcasting course coming on. If you want to get in touch with us, then check out thothwitchcraft.com. We mentor people in the art of spellcasting and magic and psychic work and all that sort of stuff. So if you want to learn that, then that's one of those things. I can't cram all of the secrets of how I can't cram all of the secrets of how spells work successfully into the last couple of minutes. But in terms of reputations and stuff, you will often find, looking back, that cunning folk, they might have had 2 careers, and very often it was these sort of careers. The local candle maker might have also been a cunning man. They might have used candles in cunning folk practices. They might have used that. Nowadays, I used to be an electrician. From leaving school, I trained an apprentice to be an electrician. When I got to be an electrician, I started to meet more and more and more clients. I built my business. I built a business in construction based on that, being a trained electrician, so on and so forth. But what I also did was I walked into houses and I had conversations with people about magic and the like. And if I walked into a haunted house and I said, there's something in this house, are you aware of that? And they said, yeah, tell me about it. I'm scared to say anything about this because everyone will think I'm a crazy. And I say, how do you feel about that? And they say, well, I want rid of it. And I say, well, I do this on the side as well. I'll get rid of it for you. Give me an extra tenner as a tip, sort of thing. Then that's how you progress it. Very often it's about pushing your name out there and that sort of thing. It depends on the reluctance. So if you're the sort of person that has the gift and is interested in magic, but doesn't like working it for other people, then you're not going to push your reputation out there necessarily. But if you're the sort that actually loves that as a career, then you're going to be encouraging that. If I want to grow my business, I answer more phone calls to go and fix broken light bulbs and banishing ghosts and stuff. If I don't want to grow my business, I start declining the phone calls. I start putting up my rates. I start saying, nah, sorry, I'm busy that day. So, you know. Is there anything else, Chris? Because I think we've run out of time. I think we only get an hour, don't we? So
we do, but when have we ever stuck to that?
We are naughty, aren't we?
Yeah, I know. But yeah, no, you know me. I bow to your knowledge when it comes to cunning folk. It's all modern history for me, so it gets a bit.
If it's post-Roman, we consider that to be normal. We consider modern. That to be modern. If it's pre-Roman, we consider that to be old/ancient. If it's Roman, it's quite old. If it predates the Roman Empire, it's ancient from our perspective. So all of this stuff about medieval magic and sorcery, we consider that to be modern from the grand scheme of things, because the practice is still quite modern. When we're talking 20th century, so post-Victorian era,
feels like last week.
We're talking about very modern/current. So, you know, it is one of those things. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I don't know what next week's episode.
No, I can't think what we've got on for next week.
But
it'll be great, whatever it is.
If you want us to cover a specific topic, it could be anything to do with magic or the occult or witchcraft or anything like that. Because of course we as the modern day professional witches, so we does it all. Then let us know.
Just let us know what you want.
Yeah, just tell us what you want us to do, and we can't promise that we'll do it, but we'll certainly take it on board. If it's a boring subject, we probably won't. But if there's something we can get an hour out of, or even just a segment of an episode out of, then we'll do it for you. Okay, so is that it?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay,
that's good. All right. And we'll see you all next Wednesday.
Yes, we'll see you at Wednesday, every Wednesday at 8 o'clock. So, goodbye.